I'm Ryan Pack.
And I'm Nicole Barlow.
And this is Soundtrack Your Life, where we talk to a guest about a soundtrack that they feel connected to. Today, we are going to talk about multiple soundtracks because we are talking to Stephen Lee Naish, author of Music and Sound in the Films of Dennis Hopper, which came out on February 16th. Welcome, Stephen.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Nicole.
So, Stephen, it's a great book. Both Nicole and I read it. It's both entertaining and informative. Why don't you tell our listeners about some of the other books you've written?
Yeah, well, thank you. So this is actually book number 7 for me. I've been writing for quite some time. My first book was a collection of essays called USA, Politics and Humanity in American Film, which was published by Zero Books back in 2014. It's out of print now. I wrote another book on Dennis Hopper called Create or Die, which came out of Amsterdam University Press in 2016. And then I wrote a book I wrote a couple of books actually about a band called the Manic Street Preachers, probably not known in your area of the world, but known very well where I came from. They're a Welsh punk band, morphed into a kind of euphoric rock and roll band. And so I wrote a book about their album, which came out in 2001 called Know Your Enemy, where they went to go play in Cuba, met Fidel Castro, and got up to some sort of very cool socialist adventures. And then back in 2001, I published a book called Screen Captures, which came out with a Canadian press called New Star Books. And it's safe to say I think that Dennis Hopper appears in all of those books somewhere down the line. It's kind of an emerging figure.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So we were talking about how we're all kind of the same super elder millennial age cohort. We were talking before the show. But where did your fascination with Dennis Hopper start?
So back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was a film student studying film back in my hometown of Leicester, which is in the United Kingdom. And I just came at it I just became very aware that this person called Dennis Hopper would just be appearing in films that I was kind of getting interested in. And also that films that my people that were on my course kept recommending to me as well. So, I would say one time I was watching The Deer Hunter or something like that, or no, just called Deer Hunter. And my friend would say, oh, well, if you like, Vietnam War movies, well, why don't you try this film called Apocalypse Now? So that weekend I'd go watch Apocalypse Now. There's Dennis Hopper. Comes about 3/4 of the way through the film and kind of takes over the film for about 20-30 minutes and then disappears. And then, I'd be sort of saying to someone, oh, how would you get into the films of David Lynch? Well, try Blue Velvet. Go watch Blue Velvet. There's Dennis Hopper. And, again, Quentin Tarantino. Oh, did you hear about this film that Tarantino wrote back in the early 90s but didn't direct? It's called True Romance. Watch True Romance. There's Dennis Hopper again. It just kept coming in. And, I was aware of him as someone who grew up in the 90s. Films like Speed, Super Mario Brothers, Waterworld. He was there. He was a mainstream actor when I was young. But as I got older, I realized that he's been doing quite a lot. And every time I saw him in a film, kind of always blew me away. So it just became a continuous journey to discover more about him and his films. And the more that I watched, the more that I liked, the more that I read, kind of discovered this person who wasn't just an actor, was a director as well, visual artist, a photographer, just someone who contains multitudes. And that really appealed to me. And it's just been since the age of 18, 19, just continuing to just discover more about Dennis Hopper, write more about him.
Yeah, it's quite an onion to peel. You make a point in your book of saying how he was an active, artist from 1955 to 2010, which is kind of remarkable, kind of unheard of. that span.
That span of time, and also just the his involvement in so much as well. You know, obviously he started in 1955, and one of his first major roles was with James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause. And then, he had ups and downs, but ultimately he worked with some of the best directors, worked alongside some of the greatest actors, knew some of the most prominent artists, of the time, like Andy Warhol, and and also musicians of that time as well. He was friends with people like Bob Dylan, Neil Young, and he kind of surfed along the waves of all these different movements of the late 20th century. It's just very interesting that he was there.
Didn't he also marry someone from the Mamas and the Papas for a total of 8 days?
He did, yeah. He married Michelle Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas, yeah. And it was a 9-day marriage, I think, yeah. It didn't start well, it didn't end well. Yeah, very unfortunate. Yeah, he did do that.
Yeah, I don't think most 9-day marriages end well.
Yeah, no, I don't. Typically,
probably for the best, though. Let's face it.
Yeah, he's such a figure of fascination for so many people, and it's hard not to get sidetracked by these little anecdotes about how out of pocket he got. Your book mentions a couple of them about him just routinely knife throwing on set and severing someone's tendons.
Yeah, I mean,
and trying to countersue and
yeah, absolutely. He was wild, and I talk about this in my previous Dennis Hopper book, Create or Die. There was a moment where after a film screening, he drove out to this soccer field or a baseball field and surrounded himself with dynamite and set all the dynamite off at the same time, and it creates a vortex basically where you're unharmed. I mean, this was the stuff that he used to do. He was a very dangerous person in the 70s and 80s, but mellowed out in the late 80s and 90s to a point. But still, he just had a bit of a wild life. So that, I mean, as a young man, that obviously kind of appealed to me too. The kind of bad boy-esque aspects of his life. But when you get over that, you realize that there's far more going on.
Yeah, and obviously your book revolves around his impact as a director and his impact on modern soundtracking. What was it that sort of inspired you to write this book that centers around his soundtracks?
So back in 2016, when I published my book, Create or Die, there was actually a chapter in there which focused on his relationship to music. The idea of this book was that, it was a collection of essays dived into different aspects of Dennis Hopper's kind of creativity. And there was a chapter in there that dealt with his relationship to music, and obviously it did cover his soundtracks, but it also covered his relationship to music throughout the late 20th century, and his odd little appearances on records, like we were talking about before we went live. His appearance on a Gorillaz record, and the fact that back in the mid-70s he opened for Bob Dylan just by going up on stage and reading poems and things like that, and I just kind of and bits of his films would appear as samples on songs by Primal Scream and things like that. And so that was, kind of the seed of the book. And then later on, I discovered basically that Routledge was publishing a series called Filmmakers and Their Soundtracks, and they were very focused little books. And I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to go back and write about Dennis Hopper from a music perspective. But also I'd been writing about music. I'd been writing music criticism, and I'd written a couple of music books as well, obviously. So it kind of, it bridged the two interests, film and music, and kind of pulled them together. And so, yeah, that's basically what I thought I would do. And obviously just Dennis Hopper is just the most obvious choice for that.
So as far as these Dennis Hopper soundtracks go, obviously I think Easy Rider is the most famous. But are there bands or artists or even genres of music that you kind of picked up on from watching these movies?
So when I first watched Easy Rider, I guess I was about 18, 19 years old. And I was already like pretty invested in the music of the 1960s and 70s. Like just from the bands, the contemporary bands that I was listening to at the time, you know, I would read interviews and they would reference influences. So in order to get more of an idea, I would go back and listen to, you know, I was a big fan of Pearl Jam when I was a kid. So I would go back and listen to Neil Young, who was a big influence on them. And big fan of Oasis. And so they would obviously reference the Beatles, and I would go back and listen to the Beatles. And I kind of got like invested in the music of that era. So when it came to like Easy Rider, I was already quite familiar with Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix, the Byrds. So I didn't really, that wasn't so much of it didn't make so much of an impact as such, but, you know, it was a cool sort of compilation of the music that I was kind of interested in at that time. But going along sort of the Dennis Hopper's soundtrack work, you know, as a white guy growing up in the middle of England, hip hop and rap music meant nothing to me at all. Like, it didn't impact my growing up at all. And so when it came to come into the film Colors, which was a Dennis Hopper film from 1988, which is about two LA cops who patrol LA sort of gangland. And the soundtrack to that is rap and hip hop. So that was actually one of the first times that I ever really listened to that kind of music. And, you know, I realized before, but also more as I researched this book, that that music is so impactful to the people who were, you know, coming up in gangs. So I would say that, yeah, you know, that kind of introduced me to a lot of music that I just had no background in listening to at all. So that was pretty exciting.
Yeah, you talk a lot in your book about how Dennis Hopper's kind of he's a little bit of a gateway artist. It sounds like it was that for you at 18, and, you know, everything that you were, you know, exposed to, it somehow involved Dennis Hopper. It always comes back to Dennis Hopper.
It does.
And I feel like, you know, for a lot of people, you know, as Ryan said, Easy Rider is kind of his most maybe iconic film as a director. It's the one everyone knows, certainly. There's a really fun anecdote in your book about Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and how they were originally supposed to be involved in the soundtrack in kind of a Simon and Garfunkel, The Graduate way. And he has this falling out with them where he feels like their lifestyle is just, it's all like limos and excess. And he's like, no, I don't ride in a limo and I can't roll with you on this. Do you think about what a CSNY Easy Rider soundtrack might have been like?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and it kind of makes, like, I don't know, like if it had emerged that they had recorded a soundtrack to it, then Easy Rider might not be remembered as fondly as it kind of is now. You know, the music that he selected, well, you know, him and his editor selected, just kind of fits the visuals so well. And I'm sure it would have been a great soundtrack. I'm sure we would still be talking about it. But I really feel that, the music that he used, and the more sort of diverse artists as well, because, you know, he throws in rock, folk, psychedelia, you know, which I'm not sure if Crosby, Stills and Nash would have been able to present.
Right.
So yeah, it kind of I don't think about it too much, but I really just sort of feel that it wouldn't be as a classic soundtrack, I think, as we now have. Right,
because you kind of can't imagine that movie without Born to Be Wild, for example, which has become a stand-in for you're going to see a motorcycle now. Like, that's a cue for you're going to now see someone riding a motorcycle. It's just
absolutely, you just cannot, you cannot get away from that. Absolutely, yeah.
I like the irony that you also bring into your book about how he, you know, basically decides to not work with CSNY because Steven Stills is riding around in a limo. But then in the 90s, he does that car commercial where he like meets his younger self from Easy Rider, and it's like, is this not like some huge hypocritical moment?
There's some kind of like boomer evolution story here with Dennis Hopper that's like a different book, right?
It's beautiful. It really is. Yeah. He kills the spirit of Easy Rider with that advert, but for some reason I still go back to it and love it. You know, it's just one of those things. But yeah, you're right. It is this kind of the sort of boomer, trying to like sell rebellion to the boomers who have all kind of grown up now and are all very sensible.
Yeah, it's that counterculture hippie to like conservative boomer pipeline.
Yeah, and you know, Dennis Hopper was Republican in the 80s and 90s as well. Pretty much hardcore Republican. Switched to Obama, so redeemed himself slightly towards the end of his life there. But yeah, he went from radical left to hard. Well, no, I wouldn't say hard right. That's not quite correct. I think he was fiscally conservative, but still quite socially liberal, I would say. So
right. And he died in 2010, so before a sort of present day.
Yes, apparently Sarah Palin was the last straw for him.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be. Yeah. I can imagine him being fine with someone like John McCain, but yeah, Sarah Palin, no. So he, no doubt, he would have hated our politics in the last, 14 years.
And yeah, you make a point about Easy Rider also being full of these, really great needle drops, which was sort of maybe a new thing at that time and a real precursor to things like Tarantino films, where you almost come to expect the picture being inseparable from the needle drop from the song. Tell us more about, I think, why Easy Rider is kind of what comes up for you when you think about that and about modern soundtracks.
Yeah, so first of all, Easy Rider really was one of the first films to use popular music in its soundtrack. It really wasn't heard of before that. I mean, you had Simon and Garfunkel making sort of original songs for The Graduate, but this was really the first time. And I think it really opened the door for a lot of, subsequent filmmakers to make these kind of like instantaneous emotional connections to the audience through music, through lyrics, or through, a certain tone or whatever. And I think it was, I just think obviously like kind of makes life easier for the director. And it kind of, because you're matching visuals to something that is already within the popular culture, you are creating, I think, a kind of image which is iconic, and you can then sort of carry on reflecting that through movies. So you think of something like Reservoir Dogs, and you think of a film. Oh, if you hear the song "Stuck in the Middle" by Steelers Wheel, you instantly know that the image just pops into your head. You know what's happening, like during that song, during Reservoir Dogs. You don't like it, it's not nice, but it makes that instantaneous connection. And there's so many songs now, like throughout the last 40, 50 years. Well, yeah, obviously a little longer, I guess, about 50, 55. That just do that. So, I can't listen to something like, I don't know, In Dreams by Roy Orbison and not picture images of Blue Velvet, David Lynch's film. And it could just continues to happen, I think. I mean, it's become, I see it as just the mainstream thing to do in film soundtracking, to make those instantaneous kind of emotional connections that the audience requires, basically.
Yeah, it's like the first time that the association became like that inescapable in the collective consciousness.
Yes.
So I find it interesting that he kind of started out in like a lot of cowboy-related media, right? So he was in Rebel Without a Cause, right? With John Wayne. And then I remember, I was also a film student, and I remember my film professor showing us an episode of Bonanza with Dennis Hopper.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I don't remember the reason why. I just remember he showed us Bonanza and Dennis Hopper shows up, and I was like, hey, that's Dennis Hopper.
Yeah. That's it is interesting. He was also in an episode of The Twilight Zone as well, which is a pretty shocking episode, actually, and especially in our current climate of far-right antagonists. He shows up as he's the main character in one of the episodes, and he's basically being whispered to by the ghost of Hitler. Yeah, it's very, but it's a very tragic little story. But yeah, he's in these. Yeah, so Twilight Zone, Bonanza. Yeah, he was all over TV, kind of from sort of 55 to 65, really, because he wasn't really able to work in Hollywood, so he did a lot of TV work.
Very much like the quintessential kind of outsider in a lot of ways, especially like through like the 70s, and I feel like he's one of those actors, like the Twilight Zone episode you just described. I'm not familiar with it, but I feel like he's kind of a Christopher Walken-esque figure, where anytime he's in something, it just automatically becomes more intense.
Yeah,
he has an intensity.
He does. Yeah, he does. He has this kind of really twitchy, wide-eyed kind of intensity to him. He's predominantly known really as a character actor. So, he certainly had leading roles, but you just you put him in any film, and yes, it instantaneously becomes way more menacing, and but just also way more interesting too, So yeah.
Yeah, and as a director, I think he made, a lot of consciously very interesting and very, non-traditional choices. And I think the great thing that your book covers is how that kind of comes through in some of his soundtracking choices too, and some of the choices that he makes over and over again in that process. And one of them that was interesting for me is that a lot of these films have signature songs. There's songs that are kind of the unofficial theme of the movie, and there are lyrical callbacks to them in some cases. They're played different ways or multiple times. So for Out of the Blue, for example, there's a Neil Young song called My My Hey Hey, Out of the Blue. From the last movie, it's the Chris Christopherson version of Bobby McGee.
Yeah.
The way I just said Chris Christopherson was really crazy, by the way.
Yeah.
Don't say fast.
Yeah, no, that totally happens. And obviously, like, Easy Rider has Born to Be Wild, but it also has, like the Bob Dylan songs as well. So there's numerous to that one. And with Colors, the song Colors by Ice-T is kind of prominent within that film.
Right.
So that's, they do kind of contain these kind of signatures. And yeah, it's interesting in Out of the Blue because, he was originally only cast in that film just to play the father role, and then he just some drama on set, and he took over production and rewrote the film. But then while he was rewriting it, Neil Young's My My Hey Hey was on the radio, and he just was listening to it over and over again, and he just basically retitled the film Out of the Blue to reference the lyrics in that film. The lyrics in that song. And then within the film, you get these lyrical callbacks as well. So you get actually, some of the main characters actually muttering those lyrics. It's quite, it was quite cool.
Really cool, and it's not something you see very often, and I think it's kind of difficult to pull off as well. So it's a cool thing when you see a movie in close conversation with a song or with its music. I think it gives it more perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was never that convinced about it when it happened in Out of the Blue, but for some reason I don't know why. I just thought it was like too obvious, but
right.
I was wrong. It is actually really quite cool, and that film has really grown in esteem in the last sort of few years. I wasn't that convinced about it when I first watched it, but you know what? The way that I watched that film to begin with, because there was no official release at the time, is I got this like DVD from Europe, and it's basically it's just some person filming the screen from a projector screen, and that's the way that I watched that movie for the very first time. And I always associate it with that. It's very bad sound, really like high contrast, visual as well. And then then in the last few years, there's been a restoration of that film, and they've done such a beautiful job, and now it looks the way it really should. So yeah, that film has definitely developed in my sort of estimate. Like, it is probably Dennis Hopper's best film.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pretty high-profile people that I guess feel the same way. You mentioned in your book that 4K restoration it was sort of spurred on by like Chloe Sevigny and Miranda July, like various people saying like this is important and needed.
Yeah, it really was. And I think I don't know if it's because maybe the film just kind of disappeared for almost 2 decades. There really wasn't a way to watch it unless you had the original reels, and you could book it for a midnight screening or something like that. It was banned in the UK until '86, I think.
Oh, wow.
But then it didn't matter anyway because it wasn't available anywhere. So, you can ban it, no one would see it. So yeah, it's a lot of high profile people got behind that campaign to give it a restoration and a re-release. And, it's been shown around the world at multiple film festivals. And the Blu-ray and the DVD transfer is just really beautiful. So yeah, I feel like, and I'm hearing as well, it was shown in my city. I live in Kingston, Ontario, and it was shown at the Independent Cinema a few years ago. And the people were younger people were coming out and just saying that is an important film. It is also a Canadian film as well, just to add that in there as well. So there's a sense of Canadian pride behind it, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're looking to Canada to keep that preserved.
Yeah. I totally forgot about this. For one, I don't think I ever read Kurt Cobain's Suicide Note because I just felt like even though I was a huge fan, it was not necessary to read it. No. But he did. I do remember that he quoted Neil Young lyrics in it, and it is the same.
He did
lyrics from
"Better to Burn Out Than to Fade Away." Yeah, he put that in there. Yeah. So obviously, I don't make any assumptions that Kurt Cobain was watched that movie or, but I feel that the same nihilism kind of exists in Out of the Blue and the music of Nirvana and Kurt Cobain's kind of final act as well. I kind of feel that there's a generational nihilism that kind of exists there.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to make any assumptions, but it kind of seems like he might have been a fan of that movie.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
It seems like a movie that he would track down, even if it was a person just recording a TV screen version of it.
Well, I mean, if you were invested in any kind of punk rock movement, so in the 1980s, I think that is probably one of the most sort of punk rock movies that you could find and watch at the time. It feels very grungy, right?
That's cool.
To me, it feels very. It's set in Vancouver, so it's on that sort of side of the North America. It feels very like Seattle, I imagine, like rainy and grey and just feels like a real
far apart. So like ecologically, setting wise, they're going to be so similar. You can totally see it. Like you can understand how.
Yeah, it feels like a very grunge kind of movie. Yeah.
Wow.
But that's also based on the way that I first ever saw the film. Grainy and dark.
So with the movies that you wrote about in this book, I mean, we have different genres of music, right? We have like 60s rock, folk, and then Out of the Blue, while it has Neil Young, it definitely has a lot of like punk sort of like attitude, and there's a lot of references to like punk, and I think there's that anecdote. Yeah, like the Sex Pistols, and there's that anecdote about that band playing and how like Dennis Hopper like just had people like waiting on set for like 12 hours before showing up, so people are like super irritable. But then you have like Colors, which is hip hop, and I mean it seems like someone that like Dennis Hopper's age in like the 80s would like not be able to have his pulse on like music or like on what's cool anymore, and he seemed to do a pretty good job of like the music in Colors, like people with Herbie Hancock doing the score and with getting like Ice-T and some of these hip hop acts, like it seems like he had a pretty good idea of like what to put in there where it doesn't seem like super dated now.
That's right. Yeah, completely. Yeah, that soundtrack is still very fresh sounding. I think it helped that he was living in LA at the time, and
in Venice, what you mentioned, right? He's like living in some...
Yeah. So he was there, and he would he tells this story, and I think I might quote it in the book that he would just kind of listen. He would just be like hearing this music drifting in from the streets, passing cars, passing people with the boom boxes or whatever, and it would just waft into the room and then back out again. He had really no idea what it was. And then I guess when he was doing some research for the film, he was driving around places like Watts, and just realized, because he was he knew that he was going to be featuring gangs like the Bloods and Crips. So he went around their neighborhoods and took photos and tried to find locations. But I guess all the time that he was doing this music was just constantly it was soundtracking his journey through these neighborhoods. So he knew that it was important to the characters. And I think what's really interesting is when you watch Colors, the only real prominent hip hop track is Ice-T's Colors, the actual theme song, and it's boosted up really high in the mix during one scene, and it's kind of a real shock, actually. It's kind of like almost that same sort of kick that you get when you listen to or when you watch Easy Rider and Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild kicks in. It's very loud in the mix, it's very high, it's very like immediate. But then the rest of the soundtrack, at least the hip hop side of things, is very low in the mix. It's very blended into the sort of scenes, and it becomes very clear that it's just what it is. It's just the music that the people are listening to, and it's just coming from their boom boxes. It's coming from their car radios or whatever. It's coming from their houses, and it doesn't really feature very highly. But for the characters, it's a constant. It's always there. So I felt that was like a really cool decision that Hopper made with that soundtrack. And then obviously the actual soundtrack itself it's like an Easy Rider style compilation of songs from that era. And I think it was one of those soundtracks that really introduced a lot of people to hip hop and rap music. So it did a really great job as a soundtrack.
Yeah, you do a lot of really great and helpful framing in the book for people that aren't familiar with Colors, or sort of what was happening in like the late 80s. Hip hop was not a mainstream phenomenon at that point. It wasn't played on the radio. It was still very much an underground thing. So the way it gets used is very pushed to the background. It's very on stereos when gang members are hanging out. It's diegetic. It's not used in quite the same way that it might be used today. But then there's also this thing in your book where you talk about how the studios were very much like, let's not make this too hardcore. Like, we want them not to be pushing drugs, but to be pushing like Benadryl or syrup or something. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, it was like a cough syrup or something like that. The original screenplay was set in Chicago, and it was sort of I don't know, like a spiked cough syrup or something like that. But when Dennis got hold of it, he just was like, no, we're going to flip it to sunny LA, and we're going to make it about real street drugs. But this is the thing. His focus in that movie is Robert Duvall and Sean Penn's, white cops. But he did admit that if he had an opportunity to make that film without the studio presence, he would have made it about gangs. He would have gone with the gang perspective. But I think he did a great job in just kind of tucking it away in that film, so that the socio-political aspects are still really present. You just got to dive in a little harder. That's all. It's all still there. Same with Easy Rider as well, actually. I mean, Easy Rider doesn't reference anything. It doesn't reference the Vietnam War, civil rights movement. or anything that's really going on, but it's kind of there, and the music is the thing that really does it for that film, that does the political legwork. That the characters really are very apolitical people.
No.
At this point in their lives anyway. So they might have been pretty radical hippies, Billy and Wyatt from Easy Rider, but they're basically just leaving society behind. So
yeah, it's a great point how the music kind of helps you understand that those things are happening like just in the periphery.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very cool.
I noticed that you mentioned in the colors chapter that Herbie Hancock's score has never been released.
No, it really hasn't. And a few fragments of it are on YouTube, I think. But yeah, as a record just to listen to on streaming or to own physical, yeah, it's not there at all. It's a real shame.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Herbie Hancock's reputation has just gotten like more and more like legendary as he's gotten older. So it just seems like quite an oversight that they wouldn't want to release this material somehow.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, hopefully they eventually do, but yeah, so far it isn't on the horizon. So, yeah.
Maybe the next time he's playing with the LA Philharmonic, I'll just scream really loud, like, "Release the colors score!"
Yeah, absolutely. Well, or hopefully there's some sort of Kickstarter campaign or something like that to get it started. I unfortunately I think that it's kind of forgotten that Herbie Hancock even did create a score for that, because the release of the soundtrack was obviously so substantial, and impactful. So yeah, it's kind of buried, unfortunately. I don't even know what he thinks about that score, actually. I don't think I've ever read an interview in which he kind of praises it or anything like that. So maybe he's just not that happy with it. I don't know. But from what I've heard of it on YouTube, it is still a good score. It uses the kind of language of hip hop as well. The beats and the scratches and the synths and stuff like that. It kind of does work quite well alongside the actual sort of hip hop and rap tracks.
Yeah, because I know that he still performs, his catalog from that era where he has, the scratching and in his songs and stuff like that. It's not like he's ashamed of that era of his career.
No, no way.
Yeah, next time I see him, I'll let him know.
You do that. Yeah. Yeah, we all want to hear it.
But I still can't get over this Steven Stills conversation with the limo. And of course, it has to be Steven Stills out of all four of them.
Out of all of them,
it's always Steven Stills.
They were probably all driving limousines at that point.
No, I'm sure they all were, but of course it's with Steven Stills where he's like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
For some reason, that completely tracks from me.
If it was going to be one of them, that's what we get.
As far as like if someone who didn't know before this episode that Dennis Hopper was a film director, what film would you recommend for them as a starter?
It's going to be so typical, but it's got to be Easy Rider, really. Just, if you want to sort of mainline all of Dennis Hopper's kind of personas or all of his aspects, this is kind of the film that you want to go into. It has obviously it has that soundtrack, but it has the ideas and the visuals. It's like, it's the purest form, I think, of kind of Hopper's work. But I would also say that, Out of the Blue, I still think is probably his best film in terms of its straightforward narrative, its performances, its use of music. But there's just kind of like there's sort of like a visual aspect that's missing there, whereas Easy Rider has this, beautiful widescreen vistas, and it's just a very immersive film to kind of throw yourself in. I actually, with Easy Rider, I've always felt that like it's Easy Rider's like whenever I put it on, it's not like I'm putting on a film, it's like I am putting on a record. It's like, it's something that you can put on in the background, but also something that you can really pay attention to. And it has the iconography as well, of Billy and Wyatt, those kind of like, I don't know, lost sons of America, as somebody who grew up in a pretty dreary place in the middle of England, watching Easy Rider, watching America on screen was just intoxicating for me. So yeah, if anyone, it's got to be Easy Rider straight up. And you know what, as well, it's the one that people have heard of as well. If you say, go for Easy Rider, they'll be like, oh yeah, I've heard of Easy Rider, sure.
I mean, it's the logical choice. And I think also, in terms of the music in that film, there may be some things that you're familiar with by just,
yeah,
being immersed in them all the time, because they're such a part of the consciousness. You might know the Byrds and you've heard Hendrix and you've heard some of these things, but maybe you haven't heard some of the more psychedelic choices. You bring up the Electric Prunes in your book. You bring up the way that there's also some truly more like underground moments with the soundtrack on Easy Rider that are really interesting and I think really indicative of that time.
Absolutely.
So it's not as straightforward as just, Born to Be Wild and the songs that people associate with that really strongly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Easy Rider just offers the most kind of instantaneous kind of hit. It's you don't need to do a lot of work with that film, but I think it would. There's obviously elements in there as well which are quite visually quite interesting as well, and you get to sort of see that Dennis Hopper's influences from the French avant-garde and the Italian neorealism kind of do infiltrate that film as well in certain aspects. So it's a straightforward American road movie, but it's also got some really interesting avant-garde things going on as well with its sound and also with its visuals. So yeah, I think it's definitely the starting point for Dennis Hopper's sort of entry point into Dennis Hopper's directorial work. Anyway, at least he does a good performance in that film, but he's mostly just the sideman in that movie. It really is down to Peter Fonda to kind of lead that film, and the iconography really settles on Peter Fonda as opposed to Dennis Hopper's character, with the the leather jacket with the upside down American flag on the back and the motorcycles and stuff. Yeah, it just a lot of appeal to that movie. A lot going on.
Are you surprised that he was not kind of more involved with like music videos? It just seems like him being such a strong having such a strong ear for music with film or movie. I mean, I guess maybe age-wise, maybe the idea of directing a music video didn't make sense to him, but it just seems like it would be such a seamless fit for him.
It would, yeah. It is probably just that the music video became quite prominent in the mid 1980s, and at that point he was pretty strung out on drugs, and but by the sort of late 80s when he cleaned up, I guess the train had passed, the ship had sailed. But it is a shame because he could have actually done some really good stuff, and it's a shame he didn't do anything more like a sort of like the Last Waltz type of thing, recording a band or a group of bands like live as well. I think that would have been quite an interesting thing for Dennis Hopper to have done, and especially because he knew so many people as well. He really probably could have stood in for Martin Scorsese when with the Last Waltz, because he basically knew everybody on that film. So that's a shame that he didn't really do stuff like that, kind of do a bit more of a sort of document of the music of that era. And so yeah, once you kind of get into the 80s and the 90s, I think he's probably just too old to do it. But he had this kind of interesting sort of pull towards playing like music managers, and he appeared as a music video director in a Mick Jagger film. Oh, I think it's called Running Out of Luck. It's a very, very bad film. But Dennis Hopper is in there as Mick Jagger's music video director. So he was kind of in there, and he appeared as this crazed music manager in a film called White Star, which is from 1984. I think it's a German film. Basically, he couldn't act in American films for about 10 years, from 1975 to 85. He was just too strung out, so he'd go and work in Europe, and that's a real capturing of a crazed Dennis Hopper performance in that film White Star. And yeah, so he was in and around music at that point, I guess, but it is a shame that he couldn't transfer his skills to music videos. He would have done a good job of, I think, especially around the punk bands as well of the late 1970s and 80s. I think he would have done a really good job of capturing their energy. Yeah, but as well, I kind of feel like you've also got Dennis Hopper to thank for music videos as well. When you look at a film like Easy Rider and the visuals that go along with some of the music, you really do see the kind of embryonic music video style.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about, because the mid 80s had Flashdance and Purple Rain and all these movies that have like very music video sort of elements, and it seems like he would have really thrived there. But when you're strung out, you're not particularly productive.
Well, he was productive, but man, he just wasn't productive in American films, I guess. But he still worked even through some of his most debauched kind of hedonistic era. He was still pumping out movies, but just not in America. He had to go elsewhere.
I think when I was researching this Gorillaz collaboration he did, I think someone was like, "Who's Dennis Hopper?" And then I think someone responded with like, "If you've seen Apocalypse Now, you can totally understand where like Nicolas Cage's like acting style comes from."
Oh, that's fantastic.
Never thought about that.
Yeah, no, actually, me neither. But when you, the crazed performances of Nicolas Cage definitely have their origins in some of Dennis Hopper's more sort of crazed work. Yeah,
and he was probably hanging out on set for Uncle Francis.
Yeah, and they did appear in a movie together, Rumblefish. Yeah, they were in Rumblefish together. Very young Nicolas Cage. I don't know if they were on screen together, but they did have a film together. I feel like there's another one as well, Red Rock West as well. They were in that movie together, and that's a pretty wild performance from both of them, actually.
Didn't realize we had been in films together. It's a really good theory. I like him, the idea of him looking at Dennis Hopper and being like, that's what I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to be from now on.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can see that, actually. I don't know if you guys have seen the film Mandy with Nicolas Cage.
Haven't.
It's from 2018. And yeah, it's basically like a revenge film, and Nicolas Cage stars as a guy who's basically unhinged and going on a rampage. It reminds me a lot of Dennis Hopper's performance in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Yeah, so in that film, Dennis Hopper is the crazed guy with the chainsaw, and in Mandy, it's the same for Nick Cage as well. So kind of very similar performances. Yeah.
So I think at the beginning of this episode we started talking about how, because of our age, we probably were introduced to Dennis Hopper in like the late 80s, early 90s, right? So, how do you kind of feel about his, I guess, sober output compared to, I don't know if I want to call it the peak era of Dennis Hopper, but I guess his earlier work.
Yeah, there is definitely quite a divide, I think. But the kind of last decade of his life and the films that he kind of made, there wasn't a great deal of quality. He was just working, he said it a bunch of times. He just liked to work, he liked to act, and he regarded himself as very lucky to be able to act. In films, because for a long period of time he really wasn't able to. The 70s period of Dennis Hopper, actually, he only made about in that whole decade probably 8 or 9 films. Some of them are some of his best films, actually, from that decade. But yeah, and then, you know, from sort of like the mid-90s onwards, it really ramps up, and he was probably making 3 or 4 a year. And the quality is not great, but there's still some moments in there. There's a film, Land of the Dead. He's in that. It's 2005. One of his last films was a film called Elegy with Ben Kingsley. That's a really wonderful film. A really beautiful film about getting old. Yeah, so that's one that I really kind of stands out. But there's a lot of stuff where he would just, you know, basically turn up for a couple of days, be menacing on screen, and then kind of just fly off to the next place, you know, whatever. But I think he always brought something to the role. You know, he always tried to bring some sort of, you know, something of his persona to the role, basically. Yeah, I don't think there was ever really a dead moment, but there's a few real stinkers in that last decade for sure. From the 90s, you know, I mean, I gotta say, I think the first time I did ever see Dennis Hopper on screen was probably Speed. It was a huge film in the UK, and obviously, you know, like I was a Sega kid, or not a Nintendo kid, so yeah, like Super Mario Brothers didn't really mean much to me when it was released, but it's a pretty awful film. I think everybody involved is quite ashamed of that film. And I think it was actually Dennis Hopper's son who said something like, why did you make this film? And Dennis Hopper sort of said, well, you need new shoes. And his son turned around to him and said, well, I don't need them that badly. But, you know, yeah, so, you know, I think they were all aware that was not a great film. But yeah, he still had some moments in those last few decades. But I think one of the most important things about him through the 90s and the 2000s is that he was just a kind of survivor, you know, just a survivor of that era. And I think a lot of people kind of were surprised by that, you know. He hit the drugs and the drink and it pretty hard, and he came out the other side and had some real good stories to tell. And yeah, that's so that I think his biggest impact in the sort of that culture was really just because he was still a figure who was alive and still had his mind together to basically be able to, you know, talk about those times in some reflection.
Yeah, I think it's kind of miraculous that he didn't overdose at any point, and that, you know, he was around for so long. I think when you meet Miles Davis at 17, because, you know, Miles Davis is punching out a heroin dealer for you. It's a pretty, you know, this is a rough start. Like, when you've been involved heavily in drugs for that long, but you have the kind of like creative spirit to kind of overcome all of that. I think it's a real testament to how much creativity he had, even through some very drugged out times.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, really. Yeah. And I think, you know, he got sober in 84, 85 and started working again in 86, and, you know, turned out in 1986 just 3 really amazing roles. So, you know, Blue Velvet, River's Edge, and a film called Hoosiers, which he was nominated for Best Supporting Actor the following year.
It's a great run. It's a strong run.
Yeah, it was a really strong return. Yeah. And, you know, I think, yeah, a lot of people were just surprised to see him back on screen and doing some really good work. And I think he was very humbled by just being able to get back into Hollywood again, and then also being able to direct again. So, you know, he came back with Colors in 88, and he made a film called The Hotspot in 1990, and a film called Chasers, which also came out in not Chasers, Catch Fire came out in 1990, and then his last film was a film called Chasers, which is from 1994. And, you know, the directorial efforts of those films are still quite strong, but the story elements are not great. But there's still some good performances and you know, still some good music in those films as well. So music was still a strong point. You know, his film The Hotspot had a Miles Davis, John Lee Hooker soundtrack, especially composed for that film, which was the first time that he'd really done that. So that was still very, very creative.
Right. I
creative
think you
person.
mentioned in your book that he would have wanted to work with Miles Davis on all his soundtracks if he had his
Yeah,
way.
that's correct. Yeah. There is a quote from him. I think it's on the sleeve to the Hotspot soundtrack, actually, in which he said he would have loved to have had Miles Davis just do all of his films, which definitely would have changed those movies for sure. I can't really picture Easy Rider with a jazz score, and I can't really picture Out of the Blue with a jazz score or anything like that. Yes, so certainly not Colors either. So it's very interesting that he would want that, but I'm glad that he got to do it because The Hotspot is actually a very flashy film for Dennis Hopper. It contains some of his best sort of cinematography, and he got some of the best. Well, he got some incredible actors on that film. So I'm glad that he got a soundtrack with Miles Davis because although the soundtrack isn't as sort of on fire as some of Miles Davis's past work, it's still quite an elegant score. So I'm glad it happened.
A lot of interesting creative what ifs, in his career, like what might have happened if. And I just think it's cool that he was so into jazz and so into Miles Davis and probably felt like he could push him to experiment or to go directions that maybe other people couldn't. I just think that's a cool relationship.
Yeah, I think I'm not massively clued up on Miles Davis's career, but just from kind of listening to his stuff from the 50s and 60s, and there was a real sort of period I think in the 1980s where his quality was very low in terms of the music that he was putting out. But I really like the soundtrack to The Hotspot. I think it's this very kind of lazy but really kind of elegant combination of jazz horn and blues guitar. They do go together really well, actually. And it's interesting that those two, John Lee Hooker and Miles Davis, they never worked together previous to that. Dennis Hopper and his music supervisor, they put them in the room together and got these other amazing musicians as well to play on that soundtrack. It was a really if it had happened without the film, that's kind of a really unique combination for that time of in the decade to have those guys in the same room together. So yeah.
How would jazz have worked in the last movie?
You know what? Jazz might have actually worked in the last movie. I think that's the one film that I could see with a jazz score, because that is a film that feels very kind of improvised and editing style kind of all over the place. A jazz score might have actually kind of worked with that film. But what it does have instead is this kind of sort of sound art component and kind of live folk recordings and live indigenous music kind of layered over everything. It's a very kind of cluttered soundtrack as it is. So I feel like a little bit of Miles Davis jazz horn. Why not? Throw it in there. Yeah. Yeah, just do it. One more thing. Yeah, exactly. One more thing. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for taking some time out to talk to us about the fascinating life of Dennis Hopper.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we really appreciate you coming on. If people want to find your book or any of your books, how can they find them?
It's just going to have to be a search on the internet, I'm afraid. Yeah, I don't have a website. I've got a Twitter. I'm at Riffs and Meaning. Oh, it's called X now. So I'm there.
No one calls it that.
Yeah, no, I can't get. So yeah, I'm around. I publish work at various places around the internet. A place called Dirty Movies, a UK publication. I sometimes write for them. Just wrote a piece actually for them that came out last week, which is a sort of I'm gonna call it a listicle, I suppose, of 10 kind of important moments within Dennis Hopper's soundtracks. So pulling 2 songs from each film that I talk about in the book, and kind of just talking about them as singular pieces of music and why they're important. So obviously Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild has to feature, and there's some Dylan, some Pointed Sticks, Canadian punk band. There's MC Sean and Roxanne Shante, and there's some Miles Davis. So yeah, it kind of tries to surf across all the soundtracks and pull just certain songs from there. So that's just been published at dmovies.co.uk.
Very cool. We'll have to hunt that playlist down, and we'll link to it in our show notes.
Oh, I appreciate
Absolutely. That would be great. And you have a book about Dirty Dancing as well. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, I do actually. Yeah. A little...
how it's not everything. I read the synopsis and I was like, I gotta get that. It sounds good.
Thank you. Yeah, it came out in 2017. It was, it was just, I love that film and I love that soundtrack. And I had such a great time writing that book. I remember it so well. It was, back in 2015. I just would, go and sit in coffee shops, go and sit in parks and just, write that film. And I would go and watch scenes from the movie in order, and I would stop and I would write. Yeah, so that was like the best time to, best memories of writing a book was when I was writing that book. So very good memories of that.
Sounds like you were having the time of your life.
I did. I had the time of my life. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm sorry, we already covered that. It would have been fun to talk to you about that.
Well, I was going to say we covered it on the podcast not too long ago, but I love when people ride for Dirty Dancing. I think it's so underrated.
What do you think of Patrick Swayze's singing voice?
She's like the wind. It's beautiful. Yeah, I really do. He pulls that song off. Wonderfully. Yeah, I think it doesn't quite fit the soundtrack in itself, but I think it's a very good stab at a song. Did he ever sing anything else other than that? I don't know. Just look that up. Maybe he released an album.
He could have.
Yeah,
I think he had written that for an album that he never released, but then they put
I think
it on
that's
the
the story. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, oddly enough, I feel like he wrote that song for the Red Dawn film, which doesn't make any sense.
Nothing really.
Yeah, so apparently he had that left over from Red Dawn, and they probably just like, well, this doesn't fit this film, so but it fitted into Dirty Dancing very well. So yeah, no, happy with that song completely.
Well, thank you again, Stephen.
Thank you.
You can find us on X or Instagram. I can't say it. We're on Twitter or Instagram at SoundtrackCast.
Oh.
And go get Stephen's book. It's great. It's a very entertaining read. You'll finish it in like a weekend.
Thank you.